Hey, welcome to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, Alan Bishop. Hey, this channel is all about home distilling and legal distilling. If you've got questions, reach out to us in the comments below, social media, or via bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. And don't forget to check out thealchemistcabinet.com. Hey, what's up guys? Back once again with the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute. Just doing a couple of talking head videos here on this beautiful Sunday morning. Been out and about and getting all the stuff done around the homestead. Last night we went out to the Spring Mill State Park candlelight walk, and I spoke in the old Daisy Spring Mill distillery as I did last year and the year before that, and enjoyed that. There were over 8,000 people came to that park, and I would say we probably got somewhere between 400 and 600 of them that stayed in the distillery 4 or 5 times to listen to my 45 to 60 minute spiel about the history of distilling in southern Indiana, plus the history of the Daisy Spring Mill distillery. So I call that a win, right? That's getting the word out there about historic distilling in the state of Indiana, specifically southern Indiana, the Black Forest, Washington, Orange, Lawrence, Crawford, Harrison, and Perry counties, and also getting the word out about modern craft distilleries, including Spirits of French Lick, Hard Truth, Old 55, and Old Homestead, which is coming along from what I hear, who have all contributed to the construction of this new historic distillery that will be state run, which is pretty cool. So anyways, just want to get into some of your questions before I get back to work on another special distilling project you'll see a video about here very shortly. So today we've got one from David Gaines. Alan, first, thanks for all your efforts to increase knowledge base of distilling. I found you about 6 months ago, and I've been listening, watching ever since. I've been fiddling around for a year now with a 16-gallon Mile High stainless Torpedo Pro. In parentheses, I know. And I've been fiddling, it's been fun for learning, but I'd like to refine it now. Eventually, I'll get to a point where I'll replace it with a better option for my needs, but it's going to have to do until I really get some skill under my belt. I'm mostly an American whiskey or bourbon drinker, so that's been the vast majority of the 20 or so all-grain batches I've run. I'll eventually play with rums and brandies after I figure out what the hell I'm doing with whiskey. This still has a 24-inch tall, 3-inch column with a Lebed condenser. It's modular, so I can add a reflux chamber or gin basket when the need calls for it. For whiskey, I obviously would like to adapt it to more of a traditional pot still. Mile High offers 14-inch still towers for $400 to $500, but I'm pretty damn sure there's a better way to go about it. If you had that set up and were headed my direction, how would you adapt the still? I've listened and watched some of your talks about Ozark Still Works and the Shocker, and would love to work in some of their homegrown stuff. Thanks for your advice and your efforts. Hey, great questions, man. I think those are questions that a lot of people have about how to modify stills to be a little more traditional for bourbon, brandy, etc. What I would do, and I like the Mile High stuff, but what I would do if I had your setup, especially knowing what I know now, is reach out to Wayne over at Ozark Still Works and get just a either get a Mr. Fusion pot still head with the built-in reflux, or just get a standard pot still head from Wayne to fit your modular setup that you already have, or get the pot still head and the Shocker so that you have the best of both worlds. But certainly get you a good pot still head. There's nothing wrong with a Lebed condenser as long as it keeps up, but I also would advise that it's always worthwhile to have a worm too, especially for more traditional things that you want to do. Now granted, most small craft distilleries nowadays use just straight up pot stills with shell and tube condensers, and I even do that at Spirits of French Lick, and I like that quite a bit. But I do think you get a much heavier bodied product when you're using a worm condenser, because you have less time for the vapor to be in contact with the copper in that system in particular, as far as that goes. So those would be my 2 biggest pieces of advice. Get you a good pot still head and get you a good worm, put those to use, and figure out the art of double pot still distillation. So, run the stripping run, pull all the alcohol off of it that you can. Maybe discard the first little bit that comes off the still, so that way if there's any tails left in your worm, that's out of the way. And then maybe whenever you go to put your low wines into the still the second time on the second run, pump off the bottom if you can and leave the oils floating on top, get rid of those. And then put it into that doubling still and make your good cuts off of that, right? That's the traditional way that bourbon was made in the United States. It's the way, in my opinion, it should have been continued to be made. And of course, pot still distillation is incredibly common still this day in Ireland and Scotland, for good reason. Same is also true with brandies, right? So traditional Hoosier apple brandy always made double pot still. Every once in a while you'd find somebody had a 3-chamber, especially when you got up around 1910, 1911 or so. You would have seen the 3-chamber here in southern Indiana, but that's a whole nother beast. Those would be the 2 biggest things I think you can do to really improve or step up your game as far as learning about more traditional distillation of spirits. So Nothing wrong with either one of those, right? And having all that modular stuff too, being able to do gin basket, etc. But keep your height fairly low. You don't want a tall tower. Yes, there are some craft distilleries out there that are doing single pass hybrid pots still with like 4 or 5 plates. And no, there's nothing wrong with those bourbons. They're actually fairly close approximations of double pot still, but they're not quite the same as double pot stills. So keep your height down, because your height is just going to give you more passive reflux if you get a breeze coming through or a temperature change or anything like that, and raise your proof and purity that much more. Keep with a low profile, and just figure out the double pot still distillation thing, man. That's the biggest advice I can give you for sure. And Wayne at Ozark Still Works would be glad to help you out with that. Absolutely. So also, if you start looking for a pot still, Ozark Still Works and my good buddy Jason Wade Harrell over at 13 Stills, both of them do fantastic work with traditional pot stills, and worth looking into. And they can make them where they're modular for you as well. So, and they also have really good prices on all that stuff. So we're gonna move forward from here. So we got another question. All right, sorry about that weird cut there, guys. This person asked me to keep them anonymous, and I accidentally said their name, so I had to cut that out of the video before I continued. But so currently working on a corn whiskey recipe, currently at 80% standard yellow dent corn, 17 malted soft red winter wheat, and 3% malted oats. So far, I'm not impressed with my test batch, aged on a used bourbon stave. Still seems very mellow corn to me. Is it possible to make much more interesting corn whiskey? Is my mash bill bland, or is it the used bourbon barrel? My goal is to have a very bourbony corn whiskey while still using used wood. Also, why don't more distillers experiment with corn whiskey? I would think the looser laws on corn whiskey would allow for cool barrels, or is 80% corn too much of one note? Oh, well, this is a great question. So I actually do experiment with corn whiskey quite a bit. At the distillery, we have a 90% corn, 10% chocolate malt. It is a chocolate and roasted coffee bomb, honestly. But there are a few distillers out there experimenting with corn whiskey. I've done a lot of different ones at home, specifically using malted corns and heirloom corns. So I would argue that yes, in some instances, 80% corn, especially if it's just going to be yellow dent corn, pretty damn bland and pretty mellow corn for sure. I think, in my opinion, so like for example, our Hindostan Falls bourbon that we do, that's 80% corn, but it's 80% Amanda Palmer corn, the variety I bred myself across over 150 different varieties I selected for over time to make open pollinated. That corn has enough flavor of its own accord that it could actually even be used as a flavoring grain. So think along these lines maybe. So think about maybe you do 80 or 90% corn, but instead of doing just standard yellow corn, you could do 50% yellow corn, and then maybe you could do 30% of another variety or multiple varieties of heirloom corns, especially with different colors, so that they have different flavor profiles and different effects on the overall whiskey itself, right? That's going to change things up. You're treating that secondary corn almost like a flavoring grain. That's going to add a lot of interesting things to the mash bill. The other thing that I would suggest is that the wheat is probably going to be, especially with yellow corn, the wheat's going to be too soft with the corn. Right, so it's going to be too sweet, too soft, too pillowy. There's not a lot of contrast. Plus, you have the oats in there, which soften things up even more, but they also give a great mouthfeel. I personally would switch over to doing a little rye in there instead, maybe malted rye, even since you did the malted soft red winter wheat. Do some malted rye, which brings some of those sort of peach and apricot notes, especially between the skin and the flesh of the fruit, into the equation. And then maybe instead of doing 17% malted rye, maybe I'd do 10% malted rye, and then up my oat quotient 7%, right? So I've got more of those oats coming through for the softness, the mouthfeel, the creamy mouthfeel sort of thing in general. I've got the malted rye in there that's certainly sweet, but also has a little character to it and can be a little bit more punchy, and certainly nothing wrong with that. And then switch out to some of those heirloom corns in order to get some of those more interesting flavors out of it. But yes, you can get great flavor out of 80% corn and even 90% corn. It's just all about the other grains you use for contrast, as well as the different varieties of corn that you're going to use in that mash bill as well. There's plenty of great places out there that will sell you corn like that. Whatever you need, and even playing around with malted corn changes things up. You know, you go to malted, even malted yellow corn is going to give you some sort of nutty kind of notes, right? I think that there's nothing wrong with used oak for doing these corn whiskeys. You know, if I were going to do it and I wanted some bourbon complexity to come into it, I would certainly use a very big, heavy, bold bourbon stave or barrel to do this with. I might even lean, honestly, if you could find it, I might even, and Bad Motivator has got some, I know, I might even use some rye whiskey barrels, some like Jack Daniel's rye whiskey barrel staves, or even potentially some Jack Daniel's Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey staves, right? Something real heavy and bold that's really going to shine through, and that is worthwhile in my opinion. So hope that answered your questions, guys. If you have any more questions for me, please always reach out to me, bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. The comments below. Check out the alchemistcabinet.com. You can also reach out to me on social media, and love y'all. Later.